the not-so-distant past, the central thread of my life's narrative was a love story, one of young love destined to be. I met him when I was 17. He was my high school sweetheart. I would later follow to college. I became his nurturer and motivator. He promised to always be there. A few years later, we ran off together to start building a new life of our own and got married exactly 10 years from the day we first crossed paths. 5 years later, we welcomed our tiny miracle human. Granted, there were always storms, but I just knew they would dissipate any instant. Happily ever after was just around the corner, waiting for me to be better, work harder, get a job, lose weight, demand less, better yet, ask for nothing. So I complied, working hard to reinvent myself and water down my dreams in service of this love story I needed as the foundation for the stable and happy home I wanted more than anything else in life. I was doing what I'd always done, constantly striving, performing, and achieving, all in pursuit of attention and validation. This transactional exchange was the only form of love I had known, the only form I believed was available to me. I persisted for 23 years, tirelessly chasing after an elusive happily ever after. I then found myself at the threshold of my midlife chapter, living a life that looked nothing like the life I envisioned for myself, and it just didn't make sense. On the one hand, I had found absolute contentment in motherhood. I was doing a pretty good job raising my Nate, an incredible human I was proud to call my child. Our bond was a pocket of joy that nourished and sustained me. But on the other hand, I was miserable, battling a persistent depression that continued to intensify. I felt like a complete failure when it came to everything else. I hadn't achieved what I knew I was capable of. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was intelligent and persistent. I was supposed to excel. But the reality was, despite graduating from law school, I didn't pursue a career or even take the bar. I was stuck. Yes, motherhood and being a trailing spouse explained some of it, but the real culprit was my brain, which felt fractured and incapable of normal functioning. My identity was in crisis. Who was I without my academic accomplishments? Even more distressing, how was I going to perform and overachieve with a fractured brain? I was depleted of my entire life force and felt weighed down by the guilt of unmet expectations. I was self-medicating to cope with the demands of daily life and sinking further into shame. It was a torturous existential crisis, a crisis, the extent and severity of which I still have difficulty acknowledging. What was going to happen when I had nothing left to give? The answer to this question was the monstrous elephant in the room I walked on eggshells around, while also pretending it didn't exist. That avoidance was the real central thread of my life's narrative. I wasn't living a love story. I was living a fear story. I was terrified of being abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me if I could no longer earn their love, and what that abandonment would prove. I was afraid it would prove I was the bad, selfish, deeply flawed person I was told I was. But there came a day when I could no longer deny acknowledging the monster's existence. It was the day I realized my love story was mostly a figment of my imagination. A story I will tell another day. On that day, I found myself taking refuge in an actual pit, a drainage pit outside my building in the middle of the night. Though I didn't know it at the time, that pit was the portal to an extraordinary rescue that I fully believe could only have been orchestrated by a divine force. This force held my hand gently and guided me to tiny little miracles that aligned in just the right order to restore the deeply felt knowing I once had with the loving presence in my heart I knew as God. First came an awakening to my true reality, and an awareness of the cage I had been confined to throughout my existence, and especially during my marriage. An invisible, to me, version of the traditional cages I was well acquainted with and the very ones I actively protested. Then came the courage to declare my freedom. I walked away from my marriage, but had to battle for my freedom. And guess what? My worst fears came true. During the battle of my life, where I even had to defend my worth as a mother, I was abandoned by those I deserved support from. It happened. But I survived because the tiny miracles continued. And then came my true freedom. I got to intimately know myself. My own heart was the place where I found refuge. It was the only place I can truly know when everything else outside became unreliable. When I looked within, without the distractions I had been surrounded by, all I found was the goodness I was born with, the love that easily and freely flows within me, and the bravery that is enabling me to slay giant monsters.